That little boy within. You catch me in one of those rare moments for me of nostalgia, although perhaps wonder best describes it. From time to time, I have this very strange experience of wondering how I got from there to here. Well, I should say something about where and when there is or was. There is a square, a courtyard. I'm not exactly sure what you'd call it these days, in the suburbs of Birmingham in the UK. This is sometime in the early 1960s. Let's say 1964, when I would have been 7 years old. It's summer and surprisingly hot. Yes, it could feel hot during the English summer when you are out there in the midday sun. This square, a quadrangle perhaps, was surrounded on three sides by rows of flats, 3 stories high, and I lived in the ground floor of one of those flats at the time. The fourth side was bordered by the road. Between the ground floor flats and this courtyard were expanses of lawn, except that on one side was a driveway, a parking area, I suppose, although we never had a car in those days and I scarcely remember ever seeing a car parked there. It was separated from the courtyard or the quadrangle by a series of bollards. This courtyard or quadrangle was paved with flagstones. I have the impression that these were pinkish and greyish, but I could have made this up. My memory of these sorts of details is quite poor. My sister, should she ever see this, would probably want to correct me. She's older than I am by a few years, and her memory appears to be more photographic than mine. Perhaps I'm fictionalizing this to some extent, but it doesn't really matter. On this courtyard were two large pieces of playing equipment, constructed of logs, complete logs, still covered in bark in many cases. At least they seemed large to me at the time. One of these was an oversized bench, which, as I recall, spent most of its time overturned. I'm sure it was never intended to be sat upon. Giants were uncommon in those days. The other piece was in the form of a ship. I don't suppose either of these pieces of equipment would pass muster these days, at least not without ample signage. Warning: play on this equipment may result in splinters and subsequent infection. Warning: parts of this equipment are situated above ground level. Falling could result in injury. So, this place and this time is the there to which I frequently return in my mind. I'm there straddling one of the cross beams of this ship, pale skinned, with blonde hair and matchstick legs, and wearing plastic sandals, probably with socks. In other words, very English. My favourite pastime was to sit on those logs armed with a magnifying glass, burning words and shapes into those logs, breathing in the acrid smoke, getting badly sunburnt, no doubt, on my arms and the back of my neck. And yes, I admit it, I would occasionally burn ants that invaded my territory. It's difficult to explain why, but this scene has become for me the symbol and summation of my early childhood years in England before we set sail in February of 1966 for Australian shores. I'm alone there. I'm aware of no sounds except maybe for my own commentary on whatever mission or adventure I may be having at that time. Were others watching? Did my mother watch from the balcony of our ground floor flat? I imagine sometimes our black and white cat, Jimmy, coming to sit with me, but this may indeed be nothing more than my imagination. And now for the here, because it's getting from there to here that sometimes leaves me slightly dazed. Actually, there's more than one here, because I've had this experience many times over the years. And the first here during which I really experienced this was in fact another there. It was during my theological training that I first experienced this sense of wonder at the transition from there to what was, at that time, here. This was at Theological College in the hills just outside Adelaide in South Australia. surrounded by eucalyptus and bottle brush. It was during our daily time of meditation prior to evensong. I was sitting on the steps outside the chapel on this occasion when this scene from my early childhood seized me. How, I asked myself, did I get from there to here? How did that little boy become this man? I would subsequently use this place and time, this time of immense solitude but not loneliness, as a place of retreat in which I would spend my contemplative time. Well, now I'm in another here, having moved on from those theological days. Now my here is Cairns in tropical far north Queensland. I am now 66 years old, and still that image of myself can fill me with, with what? Is it nostalgia, sorrow, regret? Perhaps some of all of these things, but mostly, I think, with wonder. I recall my father once expressing similar feelings. He remembered himself sitting on the front step of his childhood home. This would have been in the early 1930s. And imagining all the way ahead to the year 2000. He had never imagined that he would actually live to see a new century. Little of the physical me from that time, back in the 1960s, remains today. Our body replaces most of its cells every 7 to 10 years, but not the neural cells of our cerebral cortex. The cells I have there now, those still living anyway, are the same as those I had back then. Isn't that amazing? I've carried them with me so far and kept them reasonably safe. Most importantly, though, I try to keep the image of that boy safe. For some reason, he will always represent the there from which I've made the journey to my current here.